What happens when the most powerful military on Earth seizes a foreign head of state in the middle of the night and declares de facto control over an entire region of the world? The answer is no longer theoretical. It is unfolding right now, and it is reshaping North America in ways few people yet understand. On January 3, 2026, while much of the world was still emerging from the holidays, the United States launched a military operation in Venezuela that crossed a line not seen in decades. In the pre-dawn hours, American aircraft entered Venezuelan airspace. This was not surveillance. This was not signaling. This was a full-scale operation. Within hours, U.S. Special Forces had neutralized key military installations in Caracas and moved directly on the presidential residence. The objective was not infrastructure. It was leadership. President Nicolas Maduro and his wife were taken into custody and transported to the United States. By the end of the day, Maduro was sitting in a jail cell in New York, facing U.S. federal charges, and the United States was exercising direct control over Venezuelan territory. The last comparable operation was in 1989, when U.S. forces captured Manuel Noriega in Panama. But Venezuela is not Panama. It is larger, more strategic, and far more consequential. And what followed made that unmistakably clear. Hours after the operation, President Donald Trump addressed the world from Mar-a-Lago. He did not speak of temporary measures. He did not speak of international mediation. He declared that the United States would run Venezuela indefinitely and that American companies would control its oil reserves, the largest proven petroleum reserves on Earth, more than 300 billion barrels. Then he invoked a doctrine that should have sent shockwaves across the continent, the Monroe Doctrine. But he did not simply reference it, he rebranded it. "They call it the Monroe Doctrine now," he said. The original Monroe Doctrine, created in 1823, was a warning issued by a weak United States to European empires. It was aspirational. It lacked enforcement power. The new version is something entirely different. It is the world's most powerful military openly declaring that the Western Hemisphere is its domain, and that it intends to enforce that claim. The U.S. State Department reinforced the message on social media. "This is our hemisphere," it said. Not shared, not cooperative, possessive. This was not rhetorical improvisation. 2 months earlier, in November 2025, the Trump administration had published a formal national security strategy document outlining exactly this shift. The document declares that the United States will reassert and enforce the Monroe Doctrine and will actively deny non-hemispheric powers the ability to control strategic assets anywhere in the Americas. In practical terms, this means Washington claims the right to veto foreign investments, trade relationships, and security partnerships throughout the hemisphere. It means allies will be told to unwind relationships the U.S. considers adversarial or face consequences. This is where Canada enters the story. Because the document does not speak in abstractions, it identifies strategic assets, critical supply chains, and key geographic locations as vital to U.S. national security. And Canada has all three. The Northwest Passage, as Arctic ice melts, is becoming one of the most valuable maritime routes on the planet. Canada considers it internal waters. The United States considers it an international strait. The Canadian Arctic itself contains massive reserves of critical minerals: lithium, cobalt, nickel, rare earth elements, materials essential to semiconductors, batteries, and modern weapons systems. The Pentagon has identified more than 30 minerals as critical to national security. Canada has deposits of nearly all of them. One U.S. policy analyst wrote bluntly that Washington cannot afford to let Canadian permission be a condition for accessing these resources. That is not alliance language. That is dominance language. Venezuela, in this context, was not an isolated event. It was a demonstration. Within days, senior U.S. officials began openly discussing military action against other countries. Trump threatened Mexico, he threatened Cuba, he spoke approvingly of action against Colombia. His senior advisor posted an image of Greenland draped in an American flag and refused to rule out the use of force to take it from Denmark, a NATO ally. Denmark's prime minister responded with words that would have been unthinkable a few years ago. If the United States were to move against another NATO country, she said, it would mean the end of NATO as we know it. And then there is Canada. Trump has repeatedly referred to Canada as the 51st state. He has imposed punishing tariffs. He has openly mocked Canadian leaders. And his national security doctrine now places Canada squarely inside a US-controlled sphere of influence. Canada's former UN ambassador summarized the situation with a sentence that is echoed across Ottawa. Canada is on the menu. This is not paranoia. It is strategic reality. The question is no longer whether the United States sees Canadian resources and geography as vital. It always has. The question is whether Washington is now prepared to override Canadian sovereignty to secure them. And that is the question that will define everything that follows. When the shockwaves from Caracas reached Ottawa, Canada's new Prime Minister did not respond the way many expected. There were no dramatic speeches, no public confrontations, no emotional declarations. Mark Carney's first statement on the seizure of Nicolás Maduro was careful, almost restrained. He spoke of democracy, of the Venezuelan people, and of the importance of respecting international law. Critics immediately accused him of weakness. Opposition politicians called the response timid. Commentators demanded tougher language. But while the words were measured, the actions that followed were anything but. Within 72 hours, Canada began a strategic realignment more profound than any in its post-war history. Carney did not travel to Washington. He went to Paris. There, he joined more than 30 world leaders at a summit focused on Ukraine and European security. Standing beside Denmark's prime minister, whose country had just been threatened over Greenland, Carney made his first decisive move. He announced that Canada would send its Governor-General, Mary Simon, to Greenland the following month. Simon is of Inuit descent, with deep cultural and ancestral ties to the Arctic world. The symbolism was impossible to miss. As Washington talked about force, Ottawa talked about partnership. At the same time, Canada announced the opening of a new consulate in Nuuk, Greenland's capital, significantly expanding its diplomatic presence in the region. Carney stated clearly that the future of Greenland was a matter for Greenland and Denmark, not for external powers, and that NATO was a collective defense alliance, not an instrument of unilateral pressure. Then came a second, even more striking development. 6 major European powers, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, Poland, and the United Kingdom, issued a joint statement affirming Greenland's sovereignty and rejecting any threat of force. Canada joined them. For the first time in modern history, Canada openly aligned itself with Europe against the United States on a question of territorial integrity. This was not a misunderstanding. It was a choice, and it did not stop there. In the days that followed, Carney announced that Canada and its European partners were close to finalizing new security guarantees for Ukraine, involving more than 35 countries, independent of whatever decision Washington might make. France's president described this coalition as the beating heart of European security. Canada was no longer waiting for American leadership. It was helping to build a parallel structure. To understand how radical this shift is, you have to look at what happened even before Venezuela. In December 2025, Canada became the first non-European country ever admitted into the European Union's flagship defense program known as SAFE, Security Action for Europe. This is not a symbolic club. It is a €150 billion rearmament and procurement program designed to rebuild Europe's military-industrial base. Under SAFE, European countries receive financing to make massive joint weapons purchases and industrial investments. 19 EU states have already submitted defense plans totaling hundreds of billions of euros. And Canada is now inside that system. Under the agreement negotiated by Carney's government, Canadian defense companies can bid on EU military contracts. Canada can participate in joint European weapons purchases at preferential terms. European defense investment can flow into Canadian industry. And then Carney made a statement that should have dominated headlines but did not. He said that more than 70 cents of every dollar Canada spends on military equipment will no longer go to the United States. 70 cents on the dollar. That is not diversification. That is a strategic rupture. It is a deliberate effort to end decades of dependence on American defense suppliers and to replace it with a European-centered supply chain. The EU-Canada Security Partnership document makes this explicit. It speaks of building resilient defense supply chains between our industries. Canada's defense minister put it more bluntly. He said Canada has been allowed to step inside the European tent in a way no other non-European country ever has. This is not hedging. This is repositioning. And Canada is not alone. Japan, South Korea, and Turkey have all applied to join the same European defense framework. Even the United Kingdom tried and failed. Canada succeeded where Britain did not. The scale of Canada's own military buildup reflects how seriously Ottawa is taking this shift. Carney's first budget included more than $80 billion in new defense spending over 5 years on top of existing commitments. Canada committed to reaching NATO's 2% of GDP defense target immediately, not gradually. And NATO has now agreed on a longer-term goal of 5% of GDP by 2035. For Canada, that would mean roughly $150 billion a year in defense spending by the next decade, more than it currently spends on healthcare transfers, pensions, or unemployment benefits. This is the largest rearmament in Canadian history since the Second World War. Much of it is focused on the Arctic. New funding for permanent northern bases, new ports, airports, and all-season roads, new icebreakers, new under-ice capable submarines, expanded surveillance systems. Canada is even working with Finland to jointly build polar icebreakers. In a moment of deep irony, U.S. shipyards have confirmed that the next generation of American Arctic cutters will be based on Canadian designs. The United States is preparing to patrol the Arctic using Canadian technology, while Canada is preparing to defend the Arctic from American pressure. That is where the relationship now stands. And this is not preparation for diplomacy. It is preparation for sovereignty. All of these tensions converge in one place: the Arctic. If there is a single geographic space where the future of the US-Canada relationship will be decided, it is there. For decades, the Arctic was a zone of quiet cooperation and managed disagreement. That era is ending. At the center of the dispute is the Northwest Passage, the sea route that connects the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans through the Canadian Arctic archipelago. Canada has always maintained that these are internal waters, no different in legal status from the St. Lawrence River. Any foreign vessel, military or civilian, must request permission to transit. The United States has never accepted this claim. Washington insists the passage is an international strait, open to all vessels under the principle of innocent passage, requiring no permission. For years, this disagreement was diffused through diplomacy. The 1988 Arctic Cooperation Agreement created a practical compromise. American icebreakers would seek Canadian consent before transiting, without either side abandoning its legal position. It worked because both sides wanted it to work. That arrangement is now effectively dead. The Trump administration's national security strategy calls for continued access to key strategic locations and the ability to assert American power wherever and whenever necessary. In plain language, the United States is signaling that it no longer intends to ask. But this is not only about shipping lanes. It is about what lies beneath the ice. The Canadian Arctic contains vast deposits of critical minerals, rare earth elements, lithium, cobalt, nickel, copper, graphite, tungsten. These are not commodities. They are the foundation of modern military and technological power. Precision-guided weapons, electric vehicle batteries, advanced radar systems, semiconductors, and space technology all depend on them. The Pentagon has identified more than 30 minerals as critical to national security, and Canada has deposits of almost all of them. Trump's doctrine explicitly calls for securing access to critical supply chains and using financial and political pressure to force partners to award contracts to American companies. This is not free trade. It is economic coercion written into strategy. It means that, from Washington's perspective, Canadian resources are no longer something to be negotiated over. They are something to be secured. Canada's own intelligence agencies are no longer speaking in euphemisms. The director of the Canadian Security Intelligence Service has publicly warned about espionage and cyber operations targeting Canada's Arctic. Officially, the focus is on China, but the subtext is unavoidable. When the United States declares that it cannot allow Canadian permission to stand in the way of access to strategic assets, the risk does not come only from distant powers. It comes from the South. And here is where the irony becomes painful. The stated goal of the Donroe Doctrine is to push China out of the Western Hemisphere, to force allies to cut economic and strategic ties with Beijing. But the effect of American pressure is doing the opposite. It is pushing countries to diversify away from the United States. Canada is the most advanced example of this shift. In October 2025, before the Venezuela operation, Carney met with China's president at a regional summit, the first high-level contact in years. He later explained the logic bluntly. Canada has too many eggs in the American basket. His government has set a goal of doubling non-US trade within a decade. This directly contradicts Washington's demands. But from Ottawa's perspective, dependence has become a vulnerability. Canada is strengthening ties with Europe. It is reopening channels with China. It is building Arctic partnerships with Denmark, Norway, Finland, and other Nordic states. One analyst described Canada's position as an impossible triangle. You cannot simultaneously maintain unconditional alignment with Washington, pursue a reset with China, and preserve full sovereignty under a US doctrine of dominance. Something has to give. Carney appears to have chosen sovereignty. This does not mean Canada is becoming anti-American. It means Canada is becoming post-dependent. That is a profound change. And it is happening not because of ideology, but because of security logic. The Donroe Doctrine does not merely reject the post-1945 international order. It replaces it with a world of spheres of influence, where great powers dominate their neighbors and smaller states exist on sufferance. This is a return to 19th century geopolitics, to a world before NATO, before the United Nations, before the rules-based system built after the Second World War. The original Monroe Doctrine was issued when the United States was weak and trying to keep European empires out of the Americas. The new version is being enforced by the most powerful military in history. That difference changes everything. But Trump's strategy has triggered a reaction he may not have anticipated. Europe is not waiting to see what happens. It is rearming at a scale not seen since the Cold War. Between national budgets, EU programs, and private investment, European defense spending over the next decade is expected to exceed $800 billion, and Canada is now integrated into that system, not as an observer, as a participant. At the same time, Asian allies like Japan and South Korea are exploring similar paths. Even they are no longer comfortable with a world where American security guarantees depend on political loyalty tests. What Washington is losing is not territory, it is centrality. For 80 years, the United States was the indispensable organizer of Western security. Every crisis ran through Washington. Every alliance depended on American leadership. That system made the United States powerful far beyond what raw military force alone could achieve. Trump is dismantling that architecture and replacing it with dominance backed by coercion. The short-term effect may look like strength. The long-term effect is fragmentation. Every ally pushed away is a space opened for others to fill. China already dominates trade across much of Latin America. It is expanding influence across Africa and Asia. Every relationship Washington weakens becomes an opportunity for Beijing. Canada is not the only country recalculating. Mexico is watching, Colombia is watching, Brazil is watching. The entire hemisphere is watching, and they are drawing the same conclusion. Partnership with the United States is no longer unconditional. It comes with terms, and those terms may now include submission. What is happening now is not a temporary crisis. It is a structural break. For nearly 80 years, the political and security order of North America was built on an assumption that Canada and the United States, whatever their disagreements, ultimately moved in the same direction. That assumption no longer holds. The events of January 2026 did not create this shift. They revealed it. When the United States seized the president of Venezuela and declared its dominance over the hemisphere, it did more than redraw a foreign policy line. It forced every country in the Americas to answer a question it had been able to avoid for generations. What does sovereignty mean in a world where the strongest power no longer treats rules as binding but as optional? Canada's answer has been quiet, methodical, and profound, not with speeches, but with structures, not with defiance, but with preparation. By integrating itself into Europe's defense system, by restructuring its military supply chains away from the United States, by investing unprecedented sums into Arctic defense and independent capabilities, Canada is not preparing for war. It is preparing for autonomy. That distinction matters. This is not about confrontation. It is about not being cornered. The Arctic will be the first real test of this new reality. The Northwest Passage is no longer a legal debate managed by diplomats. It is becoming a strategic fault line. As ice melts and traffic increases, every transit becomes a question of authority. Does Canada control its own waters, or does it not? Under the old relationship, this question could be postponed. Under the Donroe Doctrine, it cannot. The United States has signaled that it will assert access where and when it deems necessary. Canada has responded by building the infrastructure, presence, and capabilities required to make its own claim more than symbolic. This is not escalation, it is deterrence. But deterrence between allies is not a healthy condition. It is a sign that trust has already eroded. The deeper consequence of Trump's strategy is not the anger of allies. It is their reorganization. Europe is building a security architecture that can function without American leadership. Canada is embedding itself in that system. Asian allies are hedging. The United States is no longer the unquestioned center of gravity. It is becoming one power among several, still immense, but no longer singular. That shift will not happen overnight, but it is now irreversible. Trust, once broken at the strategic level, does not return easily. What Washington may not yet fully grasp is what it is giving up. The post-war order did not just benefit allies, it multiplied American influence. It made the United States the coordinator, the arbiter, the indispensable partner. That position was not enforced by threats. It was sustained by predictability, by the belief that American power, while overwhelming, was constrained by rules and shared interests. When that belief collapses, so does the system built around it. China understands this very well. Beijing does not need to defeat the United States militarily to benefit from this shift. It only needs to be present when American allies look for alternatives. Every trade corridor redirected, every defense contract awarded outside the American system, every diplomatic forum that functions without Washington reduces American leverage incrementally. Canada is becoming a case study in this process, not because it wants to oppose the United States, but because it no longer feels safe relying on it exclusively. That is the most damaging outcome for any great power. Not resistance, but redundancy. Trump's vision was to make the Western Hemisphere unmistakably American. The paradox is that his method is making American leadership more conditional, more transactional, and therefore more fragile. Countries do not like living under doctrines that can be enforced against them. They adapt. They diversify. They build exits. That is what Canada is doing now. The old relationship based on ever-deepening integration is over, as Carney himself has said. What replaces it is not hostility. It is distance, strategic distance. The kind that makes conflicts less likely in the short term, but makes alliances weaker in the long term. For the first time since the creation of NORAD and NATO, Canada is planning its security on the assumption that the United States might not be a reliable partner in every scenario. That is a historic shift, and it will shape everything from procurement to diplomacy to Arctic policy for decades. When historians look back on this period, they may not focus on the seizure of Venezuela's president as the central event. They may focus on what it triggered: the quiet, irreversible diversification of American allies, the end of automatic alignment, the beginning of a more fragmented, more transactional, more uncertain hemisphere. The Donroe Doctrine was meant to demonstrate strength. It may instead be remembered as the moment the United States began to lose the loyalty that made its strength so effective. Canada will not become an enemy, but it will no longer be a satellite. It will be a sovereign middle power building its own networks, its own defenses, and its own options. And that is a world very different from the one North America has known since 1945. The tragedy for Washington is that this transformation is not being imposed by adversaries. It is being chosen by friends. And once friends start planning for life without you, the architecture of influence has already changed.